So the Grok generative AI tool just disabled a feature that allowed users to create sexual violence with image generation. So let's take a look at this. This is a pretty big deal, and I'll talk about why. And I know it's really strong language to use, and I think it's important to have intentional language and pay attention to it, especially in the world of AI, where things like intelligence attributed to AI carries a lot of meaning, especially into a broad audience. So I don't use these words lightly here, and I talk about why the way that this tool was being used to generate sexualized images is sexual violence, and then also the choice of the word feature is important. You might think of this as a mistake or as a bug, but I think the way that it was implemented and handled with Grok shows that it was really designed as a feature. So let's get into it. This is the Talk to Me PDD podcast. I'm your host, PDD. We talk about all things knowledge work, AI, leadership, management, and influence of tech on society. So welcome. Today is episode 43. Where are the limits? Grok disables sexual violence as a feature. So a lot to unpack there. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. Follow me in other areas. I'll put a bunch of things in the details of this episode. There's going to be a lot of sources that I talk about, so I'll try and put those in. You can go follow up and take a look at those. So let's talk about why this is different with Grok creating sexualized images through AI prompting. You've probably heard of deepfakes. This concept has been around for a number of years in image generation, being able to create synthetic sexualized images. Why is it a big deal now? One of the reasons why this is so easy to do is that these large language models or image generation models are trained on the internet data set, which contains a lot of pornography and sexualized images. So in a sense, they have a lot of good training data to create this type of content. I think it's also interesting and shows one of the areas that we have to be really concerned about safety and potential harms. There was a story that I'll reference that was on the AI Hype Theater 3000. I'm messing it up. I'll put the podcast details in it, but talking about a scenario that was not using a public generative AI image generator, but using Adobe for education, where a fourth grader, was trying to create some book covers for a Pippi Longstockings report and came up with these very sexualized images, even in a tool that's not trained in theory on the, public image data, but on a curated set that's owned by Adobe. So this risk is present even when companies are trying to mitigate for it or watching out for it. So that's something to bear in mind in general. I don't think that Grok was watching out for it in this case. I think this was an intentional feature that aligns with a lot of sort of their culture to quote unquote freedom in what they allow users to create. So normally when things like this happen, they're usually addressed very quickly by the platform within a matter of days. I think that's one of the big differences here. I think this feature had sort of become popular in the December timeframe, so about a month or so. And then once the sort of the alarm bells were rung, it was really about 2 weeks before anything was done to disable or mitigate the feature, which is an eternity when you have something like this out there. And also one of the interesting things was that within the terms of service about where these images were posted on X, and we'll talk about kind of the integration between Grok and X in a second, this was often a violation of the terms of use of the platform. And then obviously in many cases, this can be in violation of laws, especially when they're taking images of children or child sex abuse material, even synthetic, is often in violation of laws. So a lot of kind of existing rules and regulations that in theory should have mitigated the damages here, but they weren't. And Grok in theory is trying to be a legitimate AI capability and tool. So you would think that they would take these things more seriously. It's not something on the dark web or something that you have to try and jailbreak a model to do. It's in theory a mainstream model. So I think why this got so much attention and caused so much harm is that Grok and this capability was integrated into the X social media platform. So instead of having to go separately and create this content and then go and post it somewhere in social, you could use the Grok bot to do it directly within a conversation. So taking an image that was in X and not even having to take it off the platform, but just asking Grok to sexualize it, to put it in a bikini or some other revealing thing. You can go and kind of look at all the details of what was done there directly in the post. And then it wasn't posted by the user itself, but by the Grok user on X, which I think takes some of the accountability in theory off of the individual users. So this had been out for a while. Obviously, there was a lot of uproar about this, especially when children are involved and images of children being depicted in this way. But regardless of the age of the person, this type of sexual violence and harms are a problem, right? So instead of just disabling this feature or the whole Grok bot, instead the platform essentially did nothing. Eventually, they moved it only to paid users. So I think users paying $40 a month or something like that. And this is one of the reasons why they seem to approach it more like a feature, right? Instead of just turning it off, you're making users pay for it, but it's still there. To me, that sounds like a feature. Now, in some senses, this may make business sense. There's a real cost to this type of image generation. So they were likely losing a lot of money if many free users were using it. So if it were a legitimate feature, this might make business sense to do that. Eventually, as of a couple days ago, this feature was disabled. So clearly something that the platform had control of and could address. Like in the Adobe example, there will always be escapes, but in theory, for the most part, platforms are doing their best to mitigate this type of harmful content created in mainstream, AI image generation tools. So let's look at some of the harms of having this content on a major social media platform. There's sort of just the general exposure to sexualized content. There are minors on the X platform. It's a pretty mainstream platform, especially when getting into creation of synthetic CSAM or other types of illegal content. I think that creates some noise for law enforcement agencies. It may normalize this type of material. So dangerous there. And then obviously the victimization of the people who are subjected to images of themselves being put in these non-consensual sexualized content. And I think this is very ironic and hypocritical of X as a platform. Their whole argument was that too much wokeness was censoring more right-wing or conservative voices, and they were going to be a platform that allowed for free speech. And yes, I guess in theory you can make an argument that some of these legal images, I guess, would fall under that. But really they're being used to silence voices on their platform. So being able to create this content of sexual violence against posters directly in the content they're creating on the platform is a way to bully them and to try and silence them. And in my opinion, is very anti in the spirit of free speech. So we'll see. I guess it's free speech when it agrees with what you think, not when it doesn't. So those are some of the harms of having this content on a major social media platform. So really, it raises the question, where are the limits and where are we going to stop things that we don't agree with from happening? the fact that this took 2 weeks or so after it was raised is pretty concerning. I'm glad it did stop, and I think there's some hope that we can take from that. Um, but as I've in my parenting life read a little bit about teenagers and teenagers testing limits, and if you don't set those limits, they're just going to keep pushing further and further to see where they are and see if they exist. I think that's what we're seeing with big tech and businesses right now. I don't think we got to this point where we're creating sexual violent images as a feature overnight. There's been years of deregulation, and yes, the Trump presidency is very much in favor of not regulating tech, but it's not just that. We didn't just get here in this presidency. There's been decades where these companies have not been regulated, where monopolistic practices have not been broken up, and all sorts of things like that. I'll put a link in the comment, but Corey Doctorow's book, Enshittification, does a great job of talking about sort of the history and lack of regulation and how we got here today. So that all sets the stage for this type of thing happening, where we haven't set limits. Companies are just going to keep pushing them to see where they are. It's also kind of really interesting to me because XAI, the company behind Grok, is, in theory, trying to be a legitimate enterprise company. They have an agreement with the U.S. Army. They're trying to expand their enterprise presence. I would think that being associated with this type of content creation would reflect negatively on those more serious relationships, but apparently not. So that kind of the times that we live in. Another opportunity for limits are within, the technology space in general. So the X app lives in the Apple App Store. Apple will put ratings on the apps that are there about what type of audience that they're appropriate for. So if you were to consider an unknown company creating an app and putting it there that allows you to use AI to generate sexualized content, likely that would be for a mature audience. This was a topic that I'll link to. Hard Fork talked about in an episode they had recently. So, prior to this, X was rated at 12 plus, and then apparently it was moved up to 13 plus. So, big deal, right? I don't think many parents want their children kind of being exposed to this type of content on a platform. And that's a capability that is built in as a feature in the app. And it shows that there are really two standards for how companies are going to set these limits. One for sort of the general population, and another one for, companies once they get to a certain scale or certain level of influence. And we can speculate about why Apple did this. It may have been fear of reprisal from the Trump administration for, seeming like they were too quote unquote woke by this, or maybe it's just because there are so many users that are using the X app that they didn't want to, cause any problems there. But I think this is a miss for them, and it's a miss for sort of this idea that the tech industry can regulate themselves. I think that's really something that should have happened that did not. Okay, so AI safety, right? Like creating synthetic child sexual abuse materials, non-consensual images of people trying to post content on social media seems like a safety issue, right? We've had online safety teams in the past that would, do content moderation, try and help with this sort of thing. So it's like, surely the AI safety people would be interested in this and see this as a problem of generative AI and generative AI tools. But no, that's not the case. That's not really what AI safety is about. So I'm going to be a little bit mean here to the AI safety people, but I think they've earned it. I consider myself a nerd, but I look at these guys and it's a bunch of really smart nerds who've read a bunch of science fiction stuff about the future, and now are getting caught up in these philosophical thought experiments about, super intelligence and how that's going to destroy society. And that's fine as a thought experiment. Like there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is all of those resources that are being spent on that are not being spent on the harms that are happening today. And this is, a real one with, generating sexually violent images. Obviously, copyright issues, impact on the environment, all sorts of harms that can happen today and are happening today. You think AI safety would want to address them, but no, they don't. So if you want more on that, you can read this book, More Everything Forever by Becker, that talks a little bit about kind of how this AI safety movement came about, effective altruism, and calculating the future benefits to society, and colonizing space and building a Dyson sphere around the sun and all sorts of that type of thing. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, like I did, you can check that out. So I really think that is a missed opportunity from the AI safety people here. And you might ask yourself, why are these AI safety people and think tanks funded so well and funded by the same people that are funding these AI labs? And it goes back to sort of the words we use and the meaning behind them. If you're worried about sort of the emergence of superintelligence and you have AI safety team researching that, well, that would lead one to believe that superintelligence could be a likely output of these large language models and these AI labs. And that makes them look like they're doing pretty important work that is, worthy of the massive investments and the leeway to cut some corners in certain areas that we wouldn't normally allow companies to do. So always look where the money is and see what's behind things. So now, there's a conversation I saw in LinkedIn that specifically pointed the blame here at men, which I think is fine. And I think we've sort of unpacked some of the responsible parties that could have done more. I think the primary intent of that was that it's not Grok as an entity or an artificial language system, artificial intelligence system doing it on its own through its own intelligence or its own intentions, but to focus on the people behind that. So, we've already talked about XAI, we've talked about Apple, we've talked about the lack of regulation. These are all people that are behind that. They hold the blame, not necessarily the digital bits that are running within Grok itself. So, lastly, on the kind of that human chain of blame is the people using the platform and asking the Grok bot to create these images. It's not coming out of nowhere. It's coming out of user requests. So, the first thing that I would say is that if you don't like this sort of thing on a platform as a user, you can leave. I know that's easier for some than others. Many people have built up followings on X. It's, from the Twitter days, it's been around for a while, so it may not be easy to leave that. But you can always vote with your feet. And second, I do hold these users accountable for creating these types of images. There's always been kind of this subsection of the internet culture to kind of push just offensive and extreme images sort of as an art form, but it's always, often been relegated to kind of particular areas where you didn't have to go if you didn't want to, and as a mainstream user, and there probably weren't a ton of people there. So I'm sure some of that audience is participating in that. But I think it is more mainstream, and as much as these people creating this content are the victimizers in this case, I think it's also kind of a symptom of the way that big tech has had a predatory relationship with young men and getting them addicted to pornography and other types of things in the attention economy. And then when you sort of breed this hopeless generation of young men who are addicted to this type of content, this is the sort of behavior that gets normalized and that you see. And I read recently Scott Galloway's Notes on Being a Man. And I would not say that this is the perfect book, but I think it's really accessible to this problem that young men faced, at least in the US and probably other parts of the world. It's something that I would recommend if you know somebody sort of in that situation. And it's not to excuse this behavior, but it's to explain it and to look for healthy pathways that can build a path out of that to find purpose, to make connections, to find things in the real world, to get away from this, this content that can be really addictive to young men and take them down harmful paths. As we see inequality increase and different sort of stratification within men and their opportunities within the US, you're going to get potential dangers like this. And, angry young men with no prospects have always been, a very good tool for authoritarian organizations to weaponize and to use, and then to point that anger at other causes besides the people actually, setting up predatory, parasitic relationships, benefiting off of these young men being in that situation, and using that sort of as a weapon, to point against enemies of whatever that organization is. So I think that's part of the reason why this happens. So I think there's many different layers to blame. I think starting with the capability and the feature itself is probably the most effective way to address concerns like this. So no, we've gotten to a point now where that feature has been disabled, which is good. Shouldn't have taken as long as it did to get there. But I think that points out some really important capabilities and realities. We'll need to consider, what are the limits? What are we going to tolerate? Right now, I think a lot of people feel like there's not a lot of agency or input from most people into the direction that artificial intelligence and tech are taking, and that regulators have not shown that they're going to step in on the behalf of what people may want. So in this case, this is, I think, a victory for the people, for the crowd, for dissent. There wasn't necessarily a regulator that stepped in and did anything. I know there were some things in motion in different countries and different jurisdictions. But this idea that we have, some influence over what can happen on these platforms if we use our voice. I'll put a link into it. Luiza Jarovsky put out an article very recently, titled AI Backlash as a Regulatory Tool. So if the sort of conventional regulatory tools that we rely on to keep us safe and to keep business and tech in check aren't working, raising our voice and coming together about things that we don't approve of has shown to be effective in this case. You're seeing people start to do that and organizing around, data center construction where that may not be something the community wants. So these are real tools that we can use if we see technology going in directions that we as a society or individuals don't want. We may not be directly, as influential as some of these big tech companies or politicians are. But if we band together and we share our voice, as in this case, we can make a difference in a positive way. So I hope you enjoyed that content. I know it's kind of a heady topic. It's not something that I thought I would necessarily be addressing in one of these, but I think it's important to call out, and it's a real harm that we have to be cognizant of as we look to leverage the power of AI tools. So hopefully you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, share this out. Have a newsletter on peterdempseywrites.com/newsletter. Just sent out something around AI skilling and how that's changing from kind of a short-term sprint into a longer-term marathon. So please check out that article. I'll do my best to put some of these sources in the notes and check them out. Till next time, stay safe out there and determine your own technology. So take care.